So far this morning, we've heard a little bit about AI and weather forecasting, and Candace just touched on water quality. But now I'd like to switch gears with you guys a little bit and take us to somewhere a little bit more physical. And by physical, I'm of course talking about rocks. A few weekends ago, I happened to bring my kids to a local park that happens to run along the Marcy Gulch Drainage Way. And naturally, after about 5 to 10 minutes of playing on the playground equipment, they gravitated down towards the sound of running water. They must be like their dad. And they found this granite boulder drop structure to play on. And as I sat on the stream bank and I watched them play and I had a very wide lens view of the background, I decided to ask them. I said, how do you think these rocks got out here? I mean, where did they come from? And my son, he pondered it for a minute, and he gave me a typical answer that he usually gives when I ask him an easy question, like, how was your day, or what'd you learn at school today? He said, Dad, I don't even know. And it really dawned on me that in my 8 years of consulting before I came to the district, I operated much in the same manner, without really giving any thought to where our rocks came from in our project designs. We're somewhat blessed on the Front Range to have numerous quarries at our disposal. Some of them are along that I-70 corridor. If you've ever been stuck in ski traffic along I-70 at the interchange with Highway 6, you might have seen one of these quarries on the north-hand side. But in addition to that, the district has also sourced rock from Canyon City, Buena Vista, and we even had one project up in Boulder that we sourced rock out of Cheyenne. And of course, with these different locations, it comes with different challenges. There's different geology. You have to factor in trucking costs. There can even be seasonal hazards, such as trucking boulders over 285 in the middle of winter. But it's just something to keep in mind in our project designs. And what are we talking about when we say rocks for the district? It's typically riprap and boulders. And that riprap, it comes in sizes of a D50 from 6 inches up to 24 inches. And you might see it by itself in a conventional application, which is kind of rarely used within the district. It's kind of reserved for those areas where we don't expect to see vegetation establishment, like under a bridge. It could also be mixed with soil, which forms soil riprap, just to give a good growing medium to help establish that vegetation. And then we have void-filled riprap, where some of those voids are filled with smaller and smaller rock and even loose sand and silt. And it's meant to emulate a kind of natural gravel or cobble bed stream system. And of course, boulders, everyone's favorite. They come in sizes from 24 inches all the way up to 48 inches. And they might be used in a grouted boulder drop structure like the ones my kids were playing on. But they're also used in ungrouted applications, like a dry stack wall, or even becoming more popular nowadays are these in-stream ungrouted structures, such as a boulder cross vein or this cascading boulder drop like the picture on the right. Like others have mentioned, it's a little bit hard to see faces up here, but I have to imagine that I got a few eye rolls at the side of this quote. It's definitely not the first time it's debuted within a symposium presentation, and I can guarantee it won't be the last. But what was Heraclitus getting at with this quote? Perhaps another one of his quotes sums it up even a little bit more simply. He once said, "Change is the only constant in life." And for us, the quarries are no different. Perhaps we took for granted the relative stability that we had in our quarries for a long time. But as of late, there's been changes in ownerships as well as staffing transitions, which I think is something all of our organizations have been grappling with. But it begs the question, how much does operator experience impact the quality of our rock products? And to me, I think it's everything. When you're talking about riprap and large boulders, we don't have machinery large enough to automate the process of sorting that into different materials and gradations, and we really rely on that operator eye to get a quality product. You group that together with the current rock demand, ongoing development, mile-high projects still going strong, that's a good thing. And some of the quarries as of late, to kind of deal with some of these transitions, have implemented some supply quotas. One notable one that we heard on boulders was a 200-ton per week per project limit, which, depending on the size of your project, could make an impact. And what about the qualities of rock? What really matters to us? These top two, the specific gravity and hardness, that really relates to the general density and durability of that rock. It can be a good indicator about its ability to stand up to weathering. I had one construction manager, I think he's here today, Joe. Thank you for this, Joe. He mentioned to me that it's always important to be on site when rock is delivered. You get a real good idea of the durability of the rock by watching it get dumped out of the truck trailer. I was a little bit surprised in talking with people about this presentation that I received the most passionate feedback when it comes to color. You might notice in the picture on the lower left-hand corner, the rocks have a little bit of a pinkish red hue to it, which would indicate the presence of a potassium feldspar within the rock material. A lot of people have opinions about the durability of some of this rock, but it really comes down to the exact mineralogy of that rock about whether it's suitable for an in-stream solution. There are red rocks within Colorado that meet that bill. And then, of course, we have gradation. How might that impact our riprap? If you have a poorly graded riprap, like the graphic on the top, where there's a lot of void space between there, it's just not a good indicator of stability. A more well-graded rock, like the picture on the bottom, where there's a different mix of rock, is able to form that dense and interlocking structure that really relates to stability. It also can provide a filter function to it, especially in the soil and void-filled riprap applications, where that soil underneath it is less likely to pipe through the material. It's also much more adaptable. It's flexible to the movement of stones, which is very important in an in-stream solution. But what are some of the things that we've seen on our projects related to riprap? It almost seems like on those smaller designations, the type VL through the type M, that upper limit of the gradation or some of those bigger rocks appear to be missing. Everything seems like it's just getting a little bit smaller. And on some of those bigger gradations, like the type H and type VH, there's a good presence of the large rock and a good presence of the small rock, but that kind of middle gradation appears to be missing. And how might that impact something like void-filled riprap? If you've ever looked through the Mile High Flood District specs, this is a typical table you might have seen for a void-filled riprap mix. But it's in an ideal world where the gradations are all perfect. As I mentioned earlier, void-filled riprap is meant to emulate a natural stream bed system. But in nature, you often have a replenishing source of rocks from upstream to help replace any of those displaced rocks. In an urban system setting, we often don't have that luxury, and we really have to size the riprap appropriately so it stays placed both in low-flow events and high-flow events. Missing that gradation is really required for the stability of the structure. In this case, knowing that the type VL was missing that upper limit, we had to supplement it with a few buckets of type L that were on site for a different application to really make sure that that stability was there. And this really brings up the idea of collaboration. We've had a lot of previous symposium presentations talk about the importance of collaboration in the design process, but I'm here to tell you that it matters in construction too. When it comes to void-filled riprap, it requires the collaboration of the design engineer, the contractor, and any project inspectors. Here's just a sample walkthrough of a step process to create void-filled riprap. Since it's different materials, let's make sure all these materials are on site, they're stockpiled in different piles, and let's make an initial assessment about their size and gradation. After that, we can conduct a test batch using either a project design recipe or the standard specification. Unfortunately, void-filled riprap is very much a visual art, and people can have different opinions about what makes a good mix. That's why it's important to have all stakeholders in the field to agree upon what a stable mix looks like and make proportion adjustments together. It's also important to remember, if you have a longer running project or even a larger project where you're going to receive future material deliveries, we might have to go through this process again because the future size and gradation of those materials could change upon a new delivery. And for our contractors in the crowd, I think it's also important to know that the physical construction of void-filled riprap is an iterative process. It's not one of those standard bid items that once it's delivered to the site, you can place it and forget about it. It often requires a lot of handling. So once you've made your mix and you've stockpiled it, and you go to haul it to the location where it's going to be installed, you might have seen some segregation and some sediment out of some of those materials, and it may require you to mix it again before you have to physically place it. And then once again, once it's placed, it's always important to have that visual observation again to make sure everybody's in agreement on the material. What about shape? How does that impact the function? And by shape, I'm talking about the roundness of the rock. For riprap, if you read the Mile High Flood District specs, it says that rounded river rock is not acceptable unless directed by the design engineer. And what's the reasoning for that? It goes back to that idea of stability again. That dense interlocking material is better suited for a more angular rock. But there are situations where we have rounded riprap. And one thing to note is that it often requires a little bit of an upsize on the riprap sizing to provide the similar level of stability. And what about boulders? Here we have a great picture of a granite drop structure using a little bit of rounded boulders. The stability of that structure is really based on the underlying grout and its connection with those boulders. So in this case, it may be a good application. But let's not also forget about those ungrouted situations, such as a dry stack wall or one of those boulder cross veins. In that structure, it really relies on those boulders stacking against each other or even close abutment of adjacent boulders, which may be more suited to an angular rock. And how about dimensions? Blasting for boulders is not an exact science, and you should expect to see some different dimensions on your project site. If we once again go back to the Mile High Flood District spec, it says that the ratio between the largest and smallest dimensions should not be more than 1.5. But recently we had a project where we were trying to construct a boulder crossvein, and we received a handful of boulders that were just outside of this spec. Instead of rejecting them on site, we had a conversation with the project team about how best to utilize these boulders within the structure. And we all determined, was there an area we could place them that was less critical to the function of the structure? And we all agreed that this was out on the sill, where the boulders wouldn't be stacked together and they'd be partially embedded within the bank to provide further stability. After talking with our project partners, I heard loud and clear that production is king. The days of just rejecting material because it doesn't exactly fit the bill are gone, and we need to start working with the materials that we have. In order to combat some of the sourcing problems that we're seeing, we need to have conversations pre-bid and pre-construction about possibly pre-purchasing material or gaining access to the site so we can begin pre-staging material before full mobilization. This all comes back to that idea of collaborative construction. Conversations early and often are always key. Let's also explore some alternative material options, such as the sculpted concrete drop structure on the right. With the recent fluctuations in some of the rock pricing, the price difference between these two structures, say as a grouted boulder drop structure or a sculpted concrete, have somewhat narrowed. And these may be a viable option, especially where it's more aesthetically pleasing out in the Eastern Plains. If you've enjoyed some of this talk about rock, then I'm excited to announce that the Mile High Flood District is launching the Construction Management Academy this year. It'll be a little bit of a two-pronged training attack, including both interactive hands-on training to get people's hands dirty with some of these objects, as well as visits to active construction sites to see it in person. If this stuff interests you, please feel free to scan this QR code or visit our website at mhfd.org/Construction Management Academy. There you'll find a link to an interest form that you can fill out, and we'll be selecting participants later in the year. Thank you everyone for your time.